Good day, everybody. So for today, we shall study the skeletal system. Now, first, let us enumerate the different functions of the skeletal system. Now, our skeletal system provides a rigid framework to which the softer tissues and organs of the body are attached. And the best example of this would be the skeletal muscles. Our skeletal muscles are attached to our body framework that allows movement. Also, our skeletal system protects vital organs. Vital organs are protected by the skeletal system, such as the brain. The brain is protected by the surrounding skull. The heart and lungs are enclosed by the sternum and the rib cage. And our spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. So, vital organs are protected by the skeletal system. Also, our skeletal system provides bodily movement. Bodily movement is carried out by the interaction of the muscles and our body framework, the muscular and the skeletal systems. So for this reason, they are called as the musculoskeletal system. Also, our skeletal system produces blood cells. Blood cells are produced by the red bone marrow located in some bones. An average of about 2.6 million red blood cells are produced each second by the red bone marrow in order to replace those worn out and destroyed by the liver. And lastly, our skeletal system serves as a storage area for minerals such as calcium and phosphorus. So those are the different functions of the skeletal system. Alright, so let us now enumerate the different divisions of the skeletal system. Now, our skeletal system is composed of two major divisions, namely the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Now, let us zoom in on the axial skeleton. Now, when we speak of axial skeleton, the axial skeleton composed of bones that makes up our main body axis. And the axial skeleton is composed of the following. First, we have the skull. The skull is composed of the cranium and the facial bones. Then we have the hyoid bone that anchors the tongue and the muscles associated with swallowing. Then we have the vertebral column that protects the spinal cord. The vertebral column is part of the main body axis. And lastly, we have the thoracic cage that makes up the ribs and the sternum. So those are the bones that makes up the axial skeleton or our main body axis. So again, we have the skull. Then we have the rib cage. So the rib cage is composed of our ribs and the sternum, and we have the vertebral column. And don't forget, we also have the hyoid bone that anchors the tongue and the muscles associated with swallowing. Alright, so let us now first identify the bones that makes up the skull. Now, the skull is composed of the following bones. So first, we have the frontal bone. So this is the frontal bone, or we call this in Tagalog as noo. So that's the frontal bone right here. Then we have the parietal bone here. Itong nasa taas, that's the parietal bone. Then we have the occipital bone at the back. Ito yung tinatawag natin na batok. Alright, occipital bone. Then we have the temporal bone dito sa may tenga, dito sa sides natin. We have the temporal bone. Alright, then we have the nasal bone that forms part of the nose. Ito, this is bone. Ito kasi, this is cartilage. Then we have the sphenoid bone together with the ethmoid bone that forms the eye socket or orbit. Then we have the zygomatic bone or the cheekbone. Alright, then we have the maxilla or the upper jawbone. Then we have the mandible or the lower jawbone. So those are the major bones that makes up the skull. So frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone here at the back. We have the temporal bone, left and right temporal bone. We have the ethmoid and sphenoid bone that forms part of the eye socket. Then we have the nasal bone right here, zygomatic bone or cheekbone. Then we have the mandible, lower jawbone, and the maxilla or the upper jawbone. So those are the major bones that makes up the skull. Alright, now what about the vertebral column? Now the vertebral column is composed of the following sections. So we have the cervical vertebrae that forms the neck. We have the thoracic vertebrae that forms the chest, and the lumbar vertebrae or the lower back. Now, the cervical vertebrae is composed of 7 bones. The thoracic vertebrae is composed of 12 bones. And we have the lumbar vertebrae, which is composed of 5 bones. Plus, we have the sacrum, composed of 5 fused bones. And the coccyx, which is composed of 4 fused bones. The coccyx, or we call it the tailbone. So those are the bones that makes up the vertebral column. And lastly, we have the rib cage. So the rib cage is composed of the ribs and the sternum. Now the ribs is composed of the following. First, we have the true ribs or the vertebrosternal ribs. So the vertebrosternal ribs or the true ribs, they are directly attached to the sternum. And those are the first 7 pairs of ribs. So first 7 pairs of ribs makes up the true ribs or the vertebrosternal ribs. The vertebrosternal ribs, they are directly attached to the sternum. Then we have the vertebrochondral ribs or the false ribs. So there are 3 false ribs that are joined to the 7th rib. So again, if you will notice, pair number 8, 9, and 10, they are directly attached to the 7th pair. So we call that the false ribs. The false ribs are joined to the 7th pair. Alright. And lastly, we have 2 pairs of floating ribs. So we have pair 11 and 12. So those are the floating ribs or the vertebral ribs that are attached to the vertebral column. Alright, so for the sternum, we have the following. The sternum is composed of the following sections. We have the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. Alright, so those are the bones that comprises the eggshell bones. Alright, so let us now study the so-called appendicular skeleton. Now, the appendicular skeleton is composed of the girdles and the bones that makes up our limbs or appendages. So we have the following with the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle is composed of the clavicle and the scapula. Then we have the bones that makes up the arms or the upper limbs. Then we have the pelvic girdle or the pelvis. And we have the legs or the bones that makes up the lower limbs. So those are the bones that comprises the appendicular skeleton. So the appendicular skeleton again is composed of the bones that anchor the appendages to the eggshell skeleton. Those are the girdles and the bones that makes up the limbs. So we have the upper limbs. So the bones that makes up the upper limbs are the following. So we have the humerus, that's the bone of the upper arm. Then there are 2 bones in the lower arm. We have the radius and ulna. Then we have the lower extremities or the legs. And the legs is composed of the following bones, like the femur and tibia, fibula. Then we have the pectoral girdle that attaches the arm to the eggshell skeleton. Again, that's the clavicle and the scapula. And the pelvic girdle that attaches the legs to the eggshell skeleton. We have the pelvis. Alright, so let us now zoom in on the pectoral girdle and the upper limbs. So the pectoral girdle again is composed of the clavicle, that's the collarbone, and the scapula or the shoulder blade. So the clavicle and scapula attaches the arm to the eggshell skeleton. Now for the arm, we have the following bones. So we have the humerus, that's the bone of the upper arm, the humerus. Then the bones of the lower arm, we have the radius and ulna. So if you will notice, the radius is on top, ulna is at the bottom, and the radius is aligned with the thumb. Then we have the bones of the wrist, or the carpal bones, or simply carpals. Then we have the palm bones, or the metacarpals, and we have the phalanges of the fingers. So those are the bones that makes up the pectoral girdle, the clavicle and scapula, and the bones of the upper limbs or the arms. So the humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and the phalanges of the fingers. Alright, so these are the metacarpals, or the bones that makes up the palms or the hands, and we have the phalanges, or the bones that makes up the fingers. So those are the bones that makes up the upper extremities. We have the clavicle and scapula that forms the pectoral girdle that attaches the arm to the axial skeleton. Then we have the humerus, radius, ulna, the carpal bones or the wrist bones, metacarpals, and the phalanges of the fingers. Alright, so let us now zoom in on the lower extremities. So under that, we have the pelvic girdle or the pelvis that attaches the legs to the axial skeleton. So here is the pelvis, and if you will notice, the female pelvis is wider as compared to the male. So that's how you identify whether the framework belongs to a female or male. So the female has a wider pelvic region. If you will notice, the ischium has a wider angle compared to the male ischium. Alright, so we have the following bones that makes up the pelvis. We have the largest bone of the pelvis, or the ilium. Then this is followed by the ischium, then the pubis. So those are the bones that makes up the pelvis or the pelvic girdle. So you have the ilium, ischium, and pubis. And from the illustration, you can easily identify whether the skeleton belongs to a female or a male. Alright, then we have the lower extremities or the bones of the legs. Alright, so under this, we have the femur or the thigh bone. Then we have the patella or kneecap. Then we have the bones of the lower leg, the tibia, that's the larger bone. And we have the fibula or the slender, smaller bone. Then we have the tarsals or the ankle bones, the metatarsals that forms the foot, and the phalanges or the toes. Right, so those are the bones that makes up the pelvic region and the lower extremities. So again, we have the pelvis. Again, the pelvis is composed of those three bones, the ilium, ischium, and pubis. Then we have the bone of the upper leg, that's the femur or the thigh bone. Then we have the patella or the kneecap. Then we have here the tibia, fibula. The tibia is the larger bone, while the fibula is the slender, smaller bone. Then we have the ankle bones or the tarsals. Then we have the metatarsals that makes up the foot. And we have the phalanges of the toes. Alright, so those are the bones that makes up the pelvic region and the lower extremities. So we have here the tarsals or the ankle bones, the metatarsals that makes up the foot, and the phalanges of the toes. So all in all, we have the following 22 bones that makes up the skull. We have 6 bones in the middle ear. Then we have 1 hyoid bone. 26 in the vertebral column, 25 in the thoracic cage, 4 in the pectoral girdle, 60 in the upper limbs, 60 in the lower limbs, 2 in the pelvic girdle, and all in all, we have 206 bones in an adult skeletal framework. So those are the bones, the axial and the appendicular skeleton.
We've got, what, is it 206 bones in the body, so I might not name all of them, but I might label them all at some point. There are many other videos that go into a lot more detail. Okay, so we might describe the skeleton as having an axial skeleton and an appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the central part, the bones of the skull, the vertebrae, the rib cage, and then the appendicular skeleton are the appendices, the things that are stuck on. So not just the bones of the upper limb, but the entire shoulder girdle and the bones of the pelvis and the lower limb, the pelvic girdle. Those are parts of the appendicular skeleton. And we'll see as we go through the skeleton, not only are we a segmented organism, but also that the limbs have similar patterns. I could and have dedicated entire videos to the bones of the skull, the viscerocranium, the bones of the face, and the neurocranium, the bones of the vault, bones of that are surrounding the brain as such. So what can we see? Well, here, this bone at the front is the frontal bone. Sometimes anatomy is not hard. We have the frontal bone, and then the parietal bone, parietal meaning the wall, so the parietal bone. Down here is the temporal bone. Temporal time shows the passing of time. I might be going a little bit grey here. And the occipital bone, the occiput at the back here, the back of the head. And if we were to look, if we were to take this off, we would find inside the sphenoid bone. Here's another one, save me unscrewing that one. So if we look inside the skull, we'll see those same bones, and then we'll see the sphenoid bone is very central here, and a few other bones as well. But those are the big ones. In the face here, we have the maxilla and the mandible. This bone here is the mandible. And you see this arch here, which gets called the zygomatic arch. It's actually made up of bits of bones. So the central part here is the zygoma, or the zygomatic bone. But then look, we have a bit of the frontal bone, a bit of the maxilla, and a bit of the temporal bone, all contributing to actually form your cheekbone, the arch here, the zygomatic arch. So that's the bones of the skull. And as we drop down inferiorly, we can see a very unusual bone here. These are the vertebrae, we'll talk about those in a moment. This is the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a strange bone because it looks like a floating bone. It's floating in space. Here, we've got a little bit of metal anchoring it to the vertebrae, but that's not what we have in life. And you might be able to palpate your hyoid bone, but it's really not very nice. It's a U-shaped bone, and that's where the name comes from. It describes the U shape in ancient Greek. Anyway, and what we actually have here, the hyoid bone, is actually, it's not floating in space on its own. This is the thyroid cartilage, the laryngeal prominence, the Adam's apple. So this is the larynx, and the trachea. So the hyoid bone is at the superior end. It's the top of this of the larynx here, and the hyoid bone, then we can tell by these pointy bits, is a site of attachment for lots of muscles and ligaments and that sort of thing. And what that means is that those muscles can pull on the hyoid bone, and by pulling on the hyoid bone, they can raise and lower all of this, which is what I'm doing right now. So you can palpate this yourself. If you palpate your thyroid cartilage and you swallow, you can feel the whole thing going up and down. If you take a deep breath, and what it does is it gives much of like the tongue, gives many structures around here, and the structures of the larynx more mobility, which is important in speaking and eating and swallowing. That's the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone often comes up in crime TV programs, because the idea is if it's broken, somebody's been strangled to death. Whereas if they've been hung, it's not broken. That's not the whole story, but that's where you might have heard of the hyoid bone before. Okay then, so the vertebrae. So if we say there are 206 bones in the body, there are a lot of vertebrae. So there are 7 cervical vertebrae. Those are vertebrae in the neck, and they allow, rotation of the head and flexion and extension of the neck. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae matching the 12 ribs that attach to them. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then we have a bunch of vertebrae that have fused, and this is the sacrum, and a few remaining the remaining bones of the tail, as it were, the vestigial tail, which make up the coccyx. And in fact, the number of coccygeal bones does vary a little bit, I think. So this is why I say we've got 206 bones in the body. As usual, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So vertebrae and ribs. These are the ribs. The ribs then form the thoracic cage with this cartilage here and the sternum. The sternum has essentially 3 parts: the manubrium, which is like the handle of the sword, the body, and the xiphoid process. But this all makes up the sternum. So the sternum and the ribs and the cartilages and the vertebrae make up the thoracic cage, and by, the diaphragm helps us breathe, but also the muscles that move all of these bones, they can move the thoracic cage, increase the volume inside the thoracic cage, which decreases the pressure in there, and the lungs expand, drawing air in. So they're part of breathing, as well as protection of the things that are in there. So hanging from the rib cage, we see the shoulder girdle. The shoulder girdle then comprises the clavicle, the slender bone here, the clavicle, and you can see that's actually running from the sternum, and this is the scapula. So the scapula is a flat bone, and those two together then make a socket for the ball and socket joint of the glenohumeral joint. This is the humerus here, the first bone of the upper limb, the long bone here. This is the humerus. It's called the glenohumeral joint because this curve in here, in the scapula, is the glenoid fossa. So, you might refer to this as the shoulder joint. Really, this is the shoulder region, and the muscles of the shoulder region are largely involved in moving the upper limb. And part of moving the upper limb is also moving the shoulder girdle. Now you can see here, the shoulder girdle's rigid, right? It doesn't really want to move because it's all nailed together, because it hasn't got any muscles. But your shoulder girdle is very mobile, right? And by moving your shoulder girdle, largely what you're doing is you're changing the direction in which the glenoid fossa faces. And by doing that, you give the upper limb a much greater range of movement. The challenge, of course, is keeping that joint together, strong, safe, and giving it that range of movement. It's a trade-off, right? Okay, scapula, flat, lots of muscles attached to that, clavicle, humerus. From the humerus then, here's the elbow joint, and the 2 bones we see here are the ulna and the radius. So you've got 2 bones in there, the ulna and the radius. Now the easy way I remember it is that when you take your pulse, that's the radial pulse, because the radius is on that side. So you always take your pulse on the thumb side, don't you? It's like a natural thing. That's the radial pulse. So the radius is on the thumb side. All right, now if we look to see what we've actually got at the elbow joint, the ulna, this is the ulna here, so that is ulna, the olecranon. It's the ulna that's actually forming the hinge joint with the humerus. And the radius is this pivot joint here. So the radius can actually spin, it can rotate around that point, right? And that is what gives us this movement. The ulna doesn't move. The radius moves about the ulna. So we have pronation and supination, pronation and supination, and they're caused by the spinning of the radius. And then we get down to the wrist. The bones of the wrist are called the carpal bones. The wrist is known as the carpus, anatomically speaking. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have essentially 2 rows of 4 bones making up the carpal bones. I'm not going to name them all here. I've done a whole video on that. I'm going to label them for you so you can look at that and read them. And then if we move into the hand, you can see that these are metacarpals. So I said this was the carpus. These long bones are the metacarpals, and they're in this part of the hand. Those are the metacarpals you can feel in there. And then from there, these are the phalanges. So we have proximal, middle, and distal phalanges. Now you might notice something interesting here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Whereas the thumb is 1, 2. So we have this metacarpal bone of the thumb here. That's in there, right? So your metacarpal bone for your thumb is that bone. And then look, your thumb only has a proximal and a distal, a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx, the 2 phalanges. So that's the hand. So you see, 206 bones, we're really rapidly running through it, aren't we? Oh look, we're down to the pelvis now. Right, okay, vertebrae, so lumbar vertebrae, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. These are the intervertebral discs. And this is the pelvis here. This is the sacrum, so 5 fused vertebrae forming the sacrum, this solid bone here, and that articulates with the pelvis. But the pelvis is not one bone, and it's not 2 bones either, because we've got left side and the right side. 3 bones make the pelvis. So when you're little, you have 3 separate bones joined by cartilage. And actually, you see the hip joint here. So the socket for the head of the femur. This is the femur here. The socket is called the acetabulum, and the 3 bones that make up the pelvis, they all join at the acetabulum. And as you get older, they fuse and it becomes a single bone, a solid bone. Look, whenever we're looking at bones, we're looking at lumpy bumpy bits, and this is where muscles attach. And a bone will have lots of parts of it named. If you want to remember the names of the lumpy bumpy bits of bones, like the pelvis, it really helps to understand the names of the separate bones. So, for example, the pelvis, we have up here, this is the ilium, so it's the wing of the ilium. This is the ilium, note the spelling. This is the ischium, so you sit on your ischial tuberosities, that's the lumpy bit back there. And then, come on, this is the pubis. So we have ilium, ischium, and pubis. Those are the 3 bones that fuse together to form the hemipelvis, the pelvis on one side. And then we have 1 hemipelvis, 2 hemipelvises making up the whole pelvis and the pelvic girdle, right? And then we're on to the femur, the longest bone in the body. It's a big one. Here's the femur. Notice it's actually quite an interesting shape. It's got the neck of the femur comes in an angle here, so it pushes, these are the trochanters, it pushes it out there, bump, bump. So the femur is a really, really big bone, a really big, strong bone, because it's taking your entire body weight when you stand up, or half of it, because you've got 2 of them. The greater trochanter part of the femur, it's a big lumpy bit because it's got big muscles attached to it. You can palpate yours. That lumpy bit out the side there. So that is the greater trochanter of the femur, and when you palpate that and you palpate your ischial tuberosities, you get an idea of where these bones actually are in the body. Okay, as we descend, we get down to the knee joint, another hinge joint, and we see this bone here that's floating out here in space. This is the patella. This is a sesamoid bone. So the patella is your kneecap. Oh, look, I'm kneeling here. That's very helpful, having a patella protecting the articular cartilage covering your joint. Now the patella is actually a sesamoid bone within the muscle, within the tendon. So you've got your large quadriceps muscles extending across the knee, and the sesamoid bone is a bone that's usually within a tendon. So a bit like the hyoid bone, it's not directly articulating with other bones, but what the patella does is it gives a mechanical advantage to the muscle by pushing it away from the joint. So again, when we say there are 206 bones in the human body, we all tend to have a patella in each leg, but there are other sesamoid bones. Like there are usually a pair of sesamoid bones here under the big toe, and there are often other sesamoid bones in the body, and the number of sesamoid bones that you have might be different to the number of sesamoid bones somebody else has. The other bone of the knee joint is this big bone here. This is the tibia. So do you see how this plateau here, this big articulating surface that articulates with the femur, that's the tibia. So the knee joint is really a joint between the femur and the tibia. So down here again, look, we've got two bones, just like we had in the upper limb. We have the tibia, and fibula. I like to remember that fibula just sounds like a more delicate word. Tibia sounds like a, tough word. So the tibia is the big bone, the fibula is the little bone. But unlike in the upper limb, there's no rotation here of one bone about the other. These two are pretty tightly fixed to one another. In life, there's a membrane linking the two here. So these two bones are fixed. There's no rotation of the fibula about the tibia, none of that. Their job is load bearing. They take your weight. The tibia does most of it, the fibula does some of it, and again, you can see by the shapes of these things, they're largely about muscle attachments. All those muscles of your calf and shin, all these muscles that go down to the ankle and the foot to let you balance and stand on uneven ground, they're all coming from these muscles here. So then if we follow the tibia down, we get down to the ankle. So here's the ankle. Now, we can see a similar layout to what we see in the hand. There are a number of bones here forming the ankle, the tarsus we call it. Like we said, the wrist was the carpus, this is the tarsus, and we can see a number of tarsals, a number of tarsal bones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, there's 7 of them. Now, some of these are a little bit more important. So this is the calcaneus, your heel bone is the calcaneus. It's a really big bone because you put a lot of weight through it. Also, we've got some big muscles attached here, and you notice how the tibia and the fibula come into the tarsus a little bit anteriorly. So they're not right at the back, it's a little bit further forward, and that gives you a more stable platform to stand on, and it also gives, so the calcaneus, this is where your Achilles tendon inserts, those big calf muscles insert here. It gives those muscles of the calf a mechanical advantage. It makes them stronger relative to their size. So calcaneus, now the bone of the ankle joint properly is the talus. So talus is the bone, tarsus is the group of bones, and then, I didn't do this with the wrist, did I? But navicular, cuboid, cuneiform, cuneiform, cuneiform. So we have, those are the bones of the tarsus. And then, we have some more long bones, where these are the metatarsals, and then we have the phalanges again. And look, again, the big toe, or the great toe, has 2 phalanges, proximal and distal. The other toes have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So they have proximal phalanges, middle phalanges, and distal phalanges, or singular phalanx. All right, hey, that's it. That's all the bones of the human body. It's not though, is it? Because we've got 3 little tiny bones inside the ear. There are other smaller bones forming parts of the skull here. But the aim was to run through all of the bones of the body, introducing you to each bone, roughly, or each group of bones, and giving you a name. It's an introduction. It starts you off. You've heard all the terms, you're warmed up. If you need more detail, you can go off and get more detail and go in as deep and as complex as you need to do whatever it is you need to do or know. Okay, all right, so maybe that was useful to somebody. I don't know, God, look at the tiny ribs here. Anyway, right, done. See you guys next week, I guess.
Alright, so I hope that short video had helped you a lot in identifying the different axial bones and the appendicular bones that makes up our body framework. So before we move on to our next lecture, which is on the identification of the parts of a typical long bone, let us make an assessment. So please consider this illustration. You can pause this video and try to identify the bones in this illustration. You can start pausing the video now. Alright, so I guess we can now proceed to the identification of the parts of a typical long bone. So a typical long bone like this is composed of the following. First, we have the body of the long bone or the shaft or the so-called diaphysis. The diaphysis is made up of compact bone. Then the ends of a long bone is the epiphysis or cancellous bone or spongy bone because of the many cavities. Those cavities, they are composed of red bone marrow. Then inside the shaft or diaphysis is a cavity called a marrow cavity that contains yellow bone marrow. The yellow bone marrow is composed mostly of adipose tissue. The entire bone is covered by a membrane called the periosteum. Alright, so those are the parts of a typical long bone. Again, the bone is enclosed in a periosteum, which is that membrane which is continuous with the tendons and ligaments. The ends of a long bone is called the epiphysis, also known as spongy bone or cancellous bone because it contains cavities that contains the red bone marrow. Then we have the diaphysis or the shaft of the long bone or the middle part of the bone, which is composed of compact bone. And inside the shaft is a cavity called the marrow cavity or the medullary cavity that contains yellow bone marrow. And the yellow bone marrow is basically adipose tissue. The medullary cavity is lined with a membrane called the endosteum, which is composed of squamous epithelium. So before we proceed, let's watch this short video about the different parts of a typical long bone. Alright, let's watch this.
And I get to talk about my PhD a little bit again. Right, humerus. What else have we got? Oops. Got a femur. Got a tibia. Ooh, got a humerus. So they're all long bones. I could pick any of these as an example. This is the tibia from below the knee. And we've talked about how a bone has a compact, like a hard outer shell, the cortical bone or the compact bone, and inside it has spongy bone because it looks like a sponge, trabecularly cancellous bone. But look at the shape of this bone. It has a shaft and it has ends. I will try to refer to them as heads because the head of a bone varies depending upon which bone we're talking about. But it's this shape, this format that I'm talking about. Now the shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis. So most of the bone is the diaphysis. And then we can see the bone flares at either end, right, to a wider portion. The wider portion at either end is the epiphysis. And then the flared part, joining the diaphysis with the epiphysis, is the metaphysis. And those are the parts of the bone. Those are the words I really wanted to mention. Now what we find is, so when the bone is forming, these long bones form through endochondral ossification. That is, there is a cartilage precursor that is then replaced with bone as progenitor cells that can become bone move in with the blood. And we see that ossification occurs first in the diaphysis, and then the secondary centres of ossification are in the epiphyses at both ends. And this leaves a strip of cartilage in between the epiphysis and, well, the diaphysis. It's in the metaphysis. It gets called the epiphyseal growth plate. So this bit of cartilage in between the bone and the bone is what allows the long bone to keep growing, and that's what my PhD was about. There are chondrocytes in there, the cells of the cartilage, doing some quite special things, organised in quite special ways. They form these lovely columns of cells, and they're producing new bone at one end as continually producing new chondrocytes to make new cartilage. So if you look at an X-ray of a long bone in somebody who still has an epiphyseal growth plate, the bone, the mineralized bone, will not be radiotranslucent, it will be radio opaque. That is, it will appear white because the X-rays won't be able to pass through it very easily. But the growth plate, because it's made of cartilage, which is not mineralized, the X-rays will be able to pass through that easily. So when looking at a long bone, in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, you will see a growth plate in an X-ray of a young person, and that's not a fracture, that's a normal thing. It can be associated with fractures because it's a bit of a weak spot, that's a whole other issue, but when you're looking at X-rays, you look out for that. Now, the growth plates ossify, that is, the cartilage becomes bone, at the end of adolescence. It's related to estrogen production. So girls' growth plates ossify earlier in life than boys because they produce more estrogen earlier. So, you know, maybe 15, 16, 17, 18 years old or something. Whereas boys, their growth plates will ossify a little bit later, maybe when they're 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, sometimes even later, but usually around that age. Which is one of the reasons boys grow to be bigger than girls, is because they have longer to grow in. Okay, at the epiphysis, that's where we tend to find the condyles. So the surfaces of the bone are covered in articular cartilage and make a movable joint with another bone. So these are the condyles, which means that flared bits nearby are epicondyles. The humerus is quite a good example of this. So look, again, diaphysis, flared metaphysis, epiphyses at either end, and clear condyles, the knuckles of the bone. And with the humerus, look, we've got these epicondyles, these sticky outy bits that you can palpate on yourself. So the condyles are the articulating surfaces, the epicondyles are the sticky outy bony bits upon the condyles nearby. The humerus is a good example because the ulnar nerve runs posteriorly to the medial epicondyles. When you bang it, that's your funny bone. We can see the same thing with a femur, condyles, epicondyles, and in fact, while the femur looks like maybe it's a bit different to the diaphysis, metaphysis, epiphysis construct we were talking about earlier, that's a clear epiphysis here. This is as well. This was an epiphysis and it's been pulled in slightly different directions as muscles and tendons have attached to it and what have you. But it's the same format in that bone. If we look at the phalanges, we see the same sort of shapes, right? Diaphysis, flared metaphysis, epiphysis, condyles on either end. The long bone is articulating at its proximal and distal ends. So this format works throughout most of the body. That's it, just a few more words to add to your vocabulary so you can hold a conversation with an orthopedic surgeon or a bone biologist comfortably, all right? And we were talking about long bones. One day we'll classify bones and we'll talk about the different types of bone and stuff, but that's for another day.
Alright, so I guess that's it for that video on the parts of a typical long bone. And I hope that video had helped you a lot in identifying the parts of a typical long bone. Alright, so I guess we can now proceed with the microscopic anatomy of bone tissue. Now, we have taken this up before when we studied animal tissues. Now, everybody kindly take a look at the illustration in our PowerPoint slide. Now, bone is seen to be mapped out into a number of circular districts. As you could see in our illustration, there are a number of circular districts, and each of those circular districts, they are made up of a central hole surrounded by a number of concentric rings. These circular districts are termed osteon or Haversian systems. Now, the central hole that you could see is the Haversian canal or central canal. And around that central canal are a number of little dark spots called the lacunae, as you could see in our illustration. And that these lacunae are connected with each other and with the central Haversian canal by a number of fine dark lines which radiate like the spokes of a wheel, very obvious in our illustration. Those fine dark lines that radiate like spokes of a wheel, they are called canaliculi. Then, embedded in the lacunae are the bone cells or the osteocytes. The bone cells or the osteocytes are contained in the lacunae. So those are the parts of a typical bone tissue. So we have those circular districts or osteon, and at the center we have the Haversian canal or central canal. Then surrounding the central canal are the osteocytes in concentric rings. They are arranged in concentric rings. The osteocytes are embedded in the lacunae, and surrounding the osteocytes are tiny dark lines called the canaliculi. Alright, so to better understand the parts of a typical bone tissue, let's watch this short video about bone tissue. Alright, let's go.
Hello everybody, this is Rob Swatsky from the York campus of HAC, and in this podcast we'll be reviewing bone tissue histology with a focus now on the microscopic structure of bone tissue. The two major types of bone tissues are compact bone and spongy bone. We'll be exploring their structures and functions in this podcast. We'll examine the different types of specialized bone cells and the composition of bone's extracellular matrix. Bone tissue is a type of connective tissue, and like all connective tissues, it contains extracellular matrix, which is a substance that surrounds and separates the various cells that make up the bone tissue. The composition of the matrix is 15% water, 30% collagen protein fibers, and 55% crystallized mineral salts, such as calcium phosphate. It often combines with calcium hydroxide, another salt, to form another crystalline substance called hydroxyapatite. As these salts form, they combine with other mineral salts, including calcium carbonate, as well as potassium and magnesium ions. The collagen fibers, seen here in this micrograph as these long strand-like filaments, form sort of an internal architecture of the extracellular matrix, similar to the framework of a house. And they, as well as the spaces in between the fibers, serve as the deposition sites for all of these various mineral salts. These salts build up in a process analogous to how ice forms on branches or electrical lines. As the salts form over the collagen fibers, the matrix hardens in a process called calcification, also known as mineralization, an important early step in the bone building process. The collagen fibers also give the bone its flexibility, providing tensile strength, allowing the bone to bend a little and resist external forces before it stretches too much and breaks. This is similar to how a pencil will bend before too much force and pressure applied to it causes it to snap. There are four main types of cells found in bone tissue: osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Osteogenic cells, also called osteoprogenitor cells, are connective tissue stem cells that are undifferentiated, which means they're unspecialized. They are produced from mesenchyme tissue, which is the source of most of the body's connective tissues. They're located primarily in the endosteum and the inner layer of the periosteum. They're unique in that they're able to divide, while all of these other cells of the bone tissue cannot. The cells produced from osteogenic cell divisions through mitosis develop into another type of cell found in bone called the osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are non-dividing cells that build up the bone. The common suffix blast means to bud or to grow. They secrete the collagen fibers, help develop the matrix, and start the calcification process. Similar to painting oneself into a corner, the osteoblasts surround themselves with the matrix that they produce and become trapped. They are now referred to as the osteocytes. The osteocytes are non-dividing mature bone cells that are metabolically active and provide most of the needs of bone tissue, including nutrient and waste exchange, and help maintain the overall tissue. The osteocytes have a unique shape, with these long, slender branch processes that extend through microscopic canals in the compact bone tissue. These long processes enable the osteocytes to better communicate with other osteocytes, as well as in their exchange functions with nearby blood vessels. The osteoclasts are the largest of the bone cells and are found mostly in the endosteum. They originate as products of the fusion of large numbers of a type of white blood cell called a monocyte. They have a unique shape, with the side of the cell membrane that faces the bone surface folded into a ruffled border. This large collection of membrane surface area functions in secreting strong enzymes and acids and gives the osteoclasts a function opposite the osteoblasts in that they break down the collagen and salts of the matrix rather than build them up. This process is called bone resorption. You can remember their function by the phrase osteoclasts carve out bone. Bone takes a lot of abuse and is under constant stress and strain, so the osteoclast's resorption helps in the overall bone homeostasis, including maintenance, growth, and repair. Even though bone is very strong, it contains lots of microscopic spaces between its cells. These spaces allow passage of blood vessels and also store red bone marrow. Bone tissue is classified as either compact or spongy bone based on the size and distribution of these spaces. Most of the skeletal system is made of compact bone, about 80%, while the other 20% is spongy bone. Compact or dense bone tissue is the solid, hard, strong, external bone tissue that contains few spaces. It is the weight-bearing tissue of bone, helping to protect and support bone. Located under the periosteum, it forms most of the diaphysis or shaft of the long bone. Compact bone is built from repeating units of bone tissue called osteons or Havershan systems. Their arrangement resembles the growth rings of a tree seen in cross-section. Each osteon consists of a central canal, also called a Havershan canal, containing blood vessels and nerves, which is surrounded by rings of concentric lamellae composed of extracellular matrix. There are also perforating canals, or Folkman's canals, that transport blood vessels and nerves from the outer periosteum into the medullary cavity and central canals. Between the lamellae are little spaces called lacunae, which are where the osteocytes are located. From the lacunae are many microscopic canals filled with extracellular fluid called canaliculi. These are used as channels of communication between adjacent osteocytes and connect the lacunae to each other and also to the central canals to form a complex canal system which allows nutrient and waste exchange, as well as exchange of respiratory gases. In between the osteons are interstitial lamellae, which are the remains of older osteons. Surrounding the diaphysis are circumferential lamellae, which are connected to the external periosteum by perforating or Sharpie's fibers. The arrangement of the osteons helps provide the strength and durability of compact bone. They're running in the same direction and are parallel with the diaphysis shaft, which helps resist bending or breaking. The other type of bone tissue is spongy bone tissue, also called cancellous or trabecular bone tissue. Unlike compact bone, it doesn't have any osteons and is usually found in the interior of a bone surrounded by layers of compact bone. Spongy bone is built out of irregular bony struts that look like thin columns of concentric lamellae called trabeculae. Although the trabeculae appear random, they're arranged along lines of stress that give the bone extra resistance against breaking. In between the trabeculae are large spaces containing a rich supply of blood vessels that feed the osteocytes, and, depending on the type of bone, red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. The trabeculae help protect and support the marrow. These spaces also help reduce the weight of the bone, permitting more efficient movement. Spongy bone tissue is abundant in the interior of irregularly shaped bones like the skull bones, pelvis, and sternum. It's concentrated in the center of the epiphyses of the long bones under a thin protective layer of compact bone. We know that bone is highly vascularized and is filled with blood vessels, especially in the red bone marrow. Small arteries called periosteal arteries enter the diaphysis through perforating or Folkman's canals. They're responsible for nourishing the periosteum and the outer layers of compact bone. A large nutrient artery moves through an opening in the diaphysis called the nutrient foramen and enters into the medullary cavity. There it splits into proximal and distal branches that nourish the inner layers of compact bone in the diaphysis, as well as the spongy bone and red bone marrow close to the epiphyses. The metaphyseal and epiphyseal arteries move into their corresponding regions of the long bone and supply the red bone marrow and other bone tissues within these regions. There are also corresponding veins that drain the blood away from the long bone and are named after the regions in which they are located. Here we see the epiphyseal vein, the metaphyseal vein, the periosteal vein, and the nutrient vein.
Alright, so I hope that video had helped you a lot in understanding bone tissue. So I guess we can now proceed with the last part of this lecture. Let us now study the types of joints. Now, a joint is the point where two bones meet. And there are two general types of joints. We have movable joints and immovable joints. So before we identify the different types of movable joints, let us study the anatomy of a typical joint. Now, a joint is covered with a ligament called the bursa. And inside that bursa is a fluid called the synovial fluid. And it is obvious that the synovial fluid decreases or minimizes the friction between the two bones. Alright, so let us now identify the different types of movable joints. So first, we have what we call a ball and socket joint. So the ball and socket joint allows movement in three planes, no? As you could see in our animated illustration. So this ball and socket joint allows movement in three different planes. Like examples, we have the hip and shoulder joints. So those are examples of ball and socket joints. Alright, then we have what we call a hinge joint. So what is a hinge joint? A hinge joint allows movement in one plane, as you could see in this animated X-ray illustration. So examples of hinge joint in the body are the interphalangeal joints of the phalanges in the foot and hand, and the ulnohumeral articulation at the elbow. Alright, so the elbow basically is a hinge joint that allows movement in one plane. Alright, also our knee is a hinge joint. Alright, next we have what we call a pivot joint or a pivot joint. A pivot joint allows rotary movement. Alright, like in the atlanto-axial articulation at the base of the skull, it allows our head to be moved in this direction. Alright, okay, so that's the atlanto-axial articulation at the base of the skull. Then we have what we call the gliding or sliding joint. Now, the gliding joints are found in the foot between the tarsals and in the hands among the carpals. It consists of two flat surfaces that slide over each other to allow movement. Alright, so those are the movable joints, and what we have here are the immovable joints, or what we call the sutures, like the bones that comprises the skull. Alright, so let's watch this video about the types of joints. Alright, let's watch this.
Well, if we start at the top with the skull, the bones of the skull are joined by sutures, fibrous joints, with very wiggly bone surfaces joined together by fibers being thrown across. So these are joints that want to limit the amount of movement of these bones because they want to protect what's inside here. So the sutures of the skull, there's a whole other video on the names of the sutures because there are a lot of them, and they're named relative to the bones that they're joining. And the other joint that we see up here would be the temporomandibular joint. The temporomandibular joint is a synovial joint. That's a joint that's evolved to make a lot of movements, to move all the time. Well, you know, it's got articular cartilage in there, it's got synovial fluid lubricating everything, and that's all held together or covered up by a synovial capsule. So the temporomandibular joint it's a hinge joint, but it can also slide anteriorly, so you can protrude and retrude or retract the mandible at the TMJ, the temporomandibular joint. And as we move from the head to the neck, here's the vertebral column. There are lots of joints in here. Most of these joints that move, a great deal or are moved often are synovial joints. And the first vertebral bone is the atlas, which the skull is being supported upon. And the atlanto-occipital joint refers to the joint between the atlas and the occipital bone here. And this one doesn't move, but it's a nodding joint. So the atlanto-occipital. Okay, I'm moving these as well, but the atlanto-occipital joint is a joint that allows you to do that. And then if the first vertebra is the atlas, the second vertebra is the axis, because it has this peg that the atlas can spin around. And the atlantoaxial joint between vertebra 1 and 2, C1 and C2, is the shaking your head joint, so rotation. Yes, I am moving other vertebrae as well. And in fact, these other vertebrae, so in between the vertebrae, we have these intervertebral discs. But the vertebrae themselves articulate with one another at these facet joints, or zygapophyseal joints, which is a lovely word, but facet is easier to spell. And these are kind of like sliding joints, and there's a little bit of movement between each vertebra, but there are a lot of vertebrae, so you add all those little movements up and we can flex and extend and rotate the vertebral column using the facet joints and the joint between the body of the vertebra and the intervertebral discs. The vertebrae also articulate with the ribs. Well, some of them do. The thoracic vertebrae. So the vertebra also has a transverse process, and the rib will, those are two vertebrae, that's one rib. The rib will articulate with two vertebral bodies and also with this transverse process here. And the ribs will have a little bit of movement here, which, because of the curved nature and the shape of the rib, means that as they rotate a little bit back there, the whole rib cage you can do this on yourself. If you lift the ribs up, the rib cage pulls upwards and outwards and anteriorly to make the thoracic cage larger, to draw air in. So the ribs are also articulating at multiple joints with the vertebrae, and costal refers to the ribs. So something costal is something ribby, costal surface, costal cartilage. And where the rib articulates with the vertebra, that's the costovertebral joint. And where the rib articulates with the transverse process of the vertebra, that's the costotransverse joint. All right, running around anteriorly. So here's the rib, the bony bit. Here's a cartilage bit. Now, cartilage things get referred to as chondral. And here's the sternum, which actually has 3 different parts, and the clavicle up here. So there's actually a joint here where the bony rib becomes the cartilage bit of the ribs. And this gets called the costochondral joint here. And then that rib cartilage, okay, so the joint between the bone and the cartilage is a cartilaginous joint. Ribs are the cartilage tends to be more flexible than bone. As the rib cartilage gets to the sternum, this is where we start breaking a few rules. The joint between the sternum and the cartilage of the rib gets called the sternocostal joint or the sternochondral joint. Sternochondral sounds more correct, right? Because sternum, chondral cartilage. But it's also part of the rib, so sternocostal. And this joint here is actually a synovial joint, like the temporomandibular joint, like the joints that we move a great deal, because we are constantly moving these when we breathe in and out. Sternocostal joint. The sternum, or the breastbone, is actually made up of 3 parts. We have the manubrium, the body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process here. So for example, this joint here, this is something you can palpate on yourself. It's a good surface anatomy landmark. It marks where the second rib is. This joint here is the manubriosternal joint. Manubriosternal. You know, a lot of this is sensibly named, right? And then as we move out to the upper limbs at the shoulder girdle, the clavicle meets the sternum. Sure, it meets the manubrium, but this gets called the sternoclavicular joint here. And this is a synovial joint, but it's tightly tied together with tough ligaments. And then, as we follow the clavicle out, this bone here is the scapula. The scapula. But the scapula has some major bony prominences. This is the acromion of the scapula. So where the clavicle meets the acromion of the scapula, this gets called the acromioclavicular joint, often abbreviated to the AC joint, also a synovial joint. These are kind of joints that, like planar sliding joints, but like other synovial joints, they have the same components in there, held together tightly with ligaments. So the acromioclavicular joint. The scapula itself, that is its only bony articulation other than with the humerus, which is, you know, more lateral, more distal. The scapula is floating around the rib cage, over the rib cage, anchored in place by various suspensory muscles, which is very useful in giving the upper limb a greater range of movement. Then this little concavity here, this depression, this is the glenoid fossa. The glenoid fossa of the scapula, and that's the socket of the ball and socket joint of the shoulder joint, which is more correctly known as the glenohumeral joint, because this is the humerus of the upper limb. So the glenohumeral joint is a major synovial ball and socket joint that has a great range of movement. And then from the glenohumeral joint, if we follow the humerus distally to the elbow joint, the elbow joint, sure, it's a simple hinge joint, although we also have pronation and supination of the forearm here. But we've got 1, 2, 3 bones meeting here. We've got the humerus, we've got the radius, that's on the thumb side, and then we have the ulnar bone. So we have a humeroradial joint and we have a humero-ulnar joint, and beyond that, the ulnar and the radius are also meeting here and articulating with one another. So we have the proximal radio-ulnar joint, because this is proximal, this is distal at this end. And it's those joints that work together to give the hinging action, and it's the radius that spins here, which gives pronation and supination as the radius passes around the ulna. A very cool joint. And as we move from proximal to distal, we see the radius and the ulna meeting again. So this is the distal radio-ulnar joint, which makes sense because we still have to account for this movement, pronation and supination. But look, so these are the carpal bones of the wrist. Now, can you see? It's the radius that is articulating with the carpal bones of the wrist. The ulnar isn't. The ulnar, there's a gap between the ulnar and the carpal bones. So we have the radiocarpal joint, which means that most of the load is transferred up the radius through the scaphoid and what have you. Anyway, there are a number of joints in between all the little carpal bones. Let's just call those intercarpal joints, but you might give them individual names if you named the two bones that were sliding over one another, but intercarpal joints will do for today. This row of bones here, that's the metacarpals. So we have the carpo-metacarpal joint between this row of carpal bones and the metacarpal bones. And then these bones out here are the phalanges. So between the metacarpal and the proximal phalanx, we have the metacarpophalangeal joint, and then between the phalanges, we have the interphalangeal joints. Good, huh? Okay, we were looking at the vertebrae and the various vertebral joints. These are the lumbar vertebrae here. This is the sacrum. This is the coccyx down here. And then this is the pelvis. Now, the pelvis is made up of 3 bones. That's another interesting story about joints, because the pelvis was originally made up of 3 bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And there were joints in between them, and they have fused to a single bone on either side now. So in fact, we had more joints when we were younger, and now we have fewer joints because some of our bones have fused. Anyway, if this is the sacrum and this is the ilium, this flat, this winged bit up here, the joint between the two is the sacroiliac joint. It's a very interesting joint. It's supporting a lot of body weight. It's very irregular. I think they're actually quite unique between people. So a bit like the sutures, you've got an irregular surface mating with each other to limit the amount of movement here. But it is a synovial joint. It is heavily tied together with ligaments, with connective tissues to help support that body weight. But that is the sacroiliac joint. Now, while we're looking at the pelvis, let's run around anteriorly. And the joint on the other side here is the pubic symphysis. This is a bit like the intervertebral discs and those joints up here. It's a secondary cartilaginous joint. That is, that there is a fibrocartilage pad in between the two bony surfaces, and then that's all held together by ligaments. So it allows a little bit of movement, but not a great deal. So these bones can move independently of each other a little bit. Pubic symphysis, sacroiliac joint. And then of course we've got the big joint here. Big, strong, stable joint. And this is another ball and socket joint like we saw at the glenohumeral joint. So the socket in the pelvis here, which is made up of those 3 bones, gets called the acetabulum. And this big bone here is the femur. So this joint is the acetabulofemoral joint, also known as the hip joint. So you have to be a little bit careful with words like hip and shoulder, because this is the hip region, this is the hip joint, up there is the shoulder region and the shoulder joint. So using the word hip, using the word shoulder on its own is not anatomically accurate enough. So the acetabulofemoral joint, big, strong, heavily reinforced ball and socket joint, doesn't have the same range of motion that the glenohumeral joint has, and the glenohumeral joint is not as strong as a result. As we run distally to the knee joint, at the knee we have the femur articulating actually with the tibia. So this is the shin bone here, the tibia, this big strong bone which takes most of the load of the lower limb. The little bone here is the fibula, like a pin alongside the tibia. And you can see, hopefully, that the It's the femur articulating with the tibia at the knee joint, giving us that hinging movement. So this gets called the tibiofemoral joint. I know, if we had a rule that we would name the joints from medial to lateral or from proximal to distal, it would be so much easier to work out. But no, they've got called what they've got called. But this is the tibiofemoral joint, the knee joint. So, tibia, fibula. In the forearm, we saw that the ulna and the radius had joints. And yeah, here we have the proximal tibiofibular joint. And here we have the distal tibiofibular joint. But we don't have that pronation and supination that we saw in the forearm. So these joints are held pretty tightly. And in fact, the tibia and the fibula, can you see, we've got these bony processes here sticking out, which you can palpate easily on your own ankle. The tibia and the fibula are both contributing to make the socket of the talocrural joint. So both of these bones are involved in the joint at the ankle. So talocrural joint. Well, crus means leg. Leg anatomically is the bit between the knee and the ankle. So that's the crural bit. The talus is this bone here. So the talus is the knuckle that's going into that socket. So the talocrural joint, another synovial joint, important joint of the ankle. It's largely a hinge joint. We have inversion is that movement, eversion is that movement. Some of that can occur at the talocrural joint, but these are the tarsal bones down here. And just like the carpal bones in the wrist, these tarsal bones we could call the joints, the intertarsal bones, the intertarsal joints in between them, but also we could name each joint specifically as the names of the two bones that are being joined at that joint, but we won't go into that today. There is a whole other video on the ankle. I probably still don't even name all the joints there, because why would you? You could just... Anyway, so we have these intertarsal joints, and essentially the movements of inversion and eversion are all of these bones sliding over one another, plus the movement at the talocrural joint. And then, just like the hand, if these are the tarsal bones, these are the metatarsal bones here in this row, and these are the phalanges. So we have that's the wrong way around. So between the tarsal bones and the metatarsal bones, we have the tarso-metatarsal joints. And then between the metatarsal bones and the proximal phalanges, we have the metatarsophalangeal joints. And then between the phalanges, just like in the hand, we have the interphalangeal joints again. These are all synovial joints, obviously, because these are all nice skeletal joints that move beautifully across one another. And those interphalangeal joints are largely hinge joints, flex quite nicely. The metacarpo and metatarso-phalangeal joints, they also do that, but then they could also do that. Anyway, that's more detail, right? But that is an introduction to the names. Is that all of them? Wow. Maybe. I'm bound to have missed something. But that's an introduction to the names of all of the joints that you will find on the skeleton. And then you can go on from there and look at them in more detail as you're looking at different regions of the body. Okay. I hope that was useful. Oh, we're losing I've lost a nut. I'm going to go find a nut so this knee doesn't come apart. Right, see you next week.